Warrior, welcome today. We use the hashtag every single day, community creates change. Today, we have one of the biggest warriors I know joining us, truly doing the work that needs to be done regarding human trafficking and supporting the survivors. We're going to get into all of that. We have David Weiss joining us, and it is a complete honor that he is taking the time from his incredibly busy schedule. He is the chief of the Human Trafficking Unit of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, also the chair of the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force. He is a sought-after speaker, not only here in our beloved New York State, but also around the United States and also internationally, sharing his thoughts, his work, his expertise with the international law enforcement community. You can follow all of this work. Go to brooklynda.org and also support David, support the community. We're going to be talking about facts and realities, so buckle up. And I'm just going to jump right into it. David Weiss, welcome to the Warriors.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Listen, I am truly honored that you are. I can't emphasize that enough. I know what kind of schedule you have. Before we get into the incredible work that you do, and I want to put the emphasis on survivor, because that is what is needed in this whole, for lack of a better word, movement in order to heal and educate the survivor voice. Prosecuting without a victim is one of sort of your taglines, if you don't mind me saying that. I want to hear a little bit about you. What got you into, why did you want to become a lawyer? What got you involved in all of this?
So that kind of just fell into it. I graduated college. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, went to law school. And even in law school, I wasn't sure. I know a lot of people go to big firms or public service. And I ended up interning at a DA's office over the summer and worked on some really meaningful cases and saw the impact that the ADAs that I was interning for were working on, the cases they were working on, and the meetings with the victims and the things they were able to do. And I kind of said, that's what I want to do. That's my passion. Working in, not taking anything away from the private sector, but the public service, I felt that pull. And I said, this is where I think law people can make the best option and best difference. And that's what I decided I wanted to do, and kind of tailored my law school career towards criminal law in those cases and internships in the district attorney's office. And then after I graduated, I got hired and been working for the Brooklyn DA's office ever since.
And unbelievable. I like to say, David, anybody who has that, it's actually, you're, I think, born with a passion. You know what I'm saying? It's like instilled in you, because this is tough stuff. What you do, what I do, what a lot of our colleagues do, but you handle it with such, kind of finesse and kind of, always fact-based, the reality of the landscape of what's going on, here in Brooklyn, where you are, New York State as well. Let me ask you something. Okay, first, let's break it down. Describe your job and what the unit does.
So like you mentioned, there was two parts. So the first part is, excuse me, I'm the chief of the Human Trafficking Unit. So we're a dedicated unit comprised of prosecutors, assistant district attorneys. We have dedicated intelligence analysts that work on our cases. We have paralegals and detective investigators that are solely focused on investigating and prosecuting human trafficking cases, all forms, which comprise of sex trafficking of adults through fraud, force, or coercion, trafficking of minors, as well as labor trafficking. So our unit investigates from the beginning, from when a tip comes in. We work with, whether it's our own detective investigator or we work with the police department or other law enforcement partners to investigate the case from the beginning, from the initial tip, right from the beginning. We don't wait till an arrest is made. We don't wait till further down the line. We're involved from the jump.
And I recommend, again, all of this, David, will be in the body of this video, brooklynda.org, because you have a chart, which is, self-explanatory, where, again, when I say community creates change, it's a full-on approach. I like to say, think of a wheel with a lot of different spokes. Your unit working all together to get at this crime. How would you describe the landscape? The landscape of sex trafficking. We also have to include labor trafficking. We don't talk,
Absolutely,
in my opinion, enough about that. A lot of that's going on right now. What do you want to say about the landscape of all of this?
So just an understanding of what the landscape of what is going on in New York, which is similar to a lot of other places. But from the sex trafficking side, we're seeing a lot of forced prostitution for adults, from violent pimps, with the nicer, for quote unquote, the nicer pimps that don't use violence but use other methods of coercion to enable the person to submit to the will of the trafficker. We see a lot of the sex trafficking of children and minors, and we'll touch a little bit later maybe about the laws, but for trafficking victims of minors, we don't have to prove the force. There isn't that element, but it is kids young as 13, 14, 15, 16 that we're seeing involved in prostitution. There's a lot in Brooklyn in particular. There's a street prostitution track where it brings a lot of violent traffickers where teenagers and adults, they're walking the streets all hours of the day and night, all times of the year, at the behest of the traffickers. And with that comes the violence and assault of what historically we've seen in street violence, where there's shootings, there's robberies. And that's something that our office is very focused on, ensuring that the victims and survivors are kept safe, as well as the community. We're talking about the community of having people that live in that area being able to walk down the street and not have fear of violence. We've been seeing trafficking in hotels, the online escort advertisements where it's hotel based, it's apartment based, and that's all online advertisements where what's called the in call and out call, where the activities are happening all over the place. So we're really seeing the full spectrum of trafficking that occurs everywhere, and that's occurring in Brooklyn. And the dynamic of New York City is a little bit more unique because of how New York City is compromised, where there's so many little cities next to each other where they're going from Brooklyn to Manhattan to Queens, Bronx on a regular basis, where you're crossing a street and now you're in another county. So it can make things challenging as well, because now we're dealing with different offices and different jurisdiction issues that potentially a larger county that is isolated may not have to deal with.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that. Do you want to weigh in at all on the impact of youth? We're very focused at the Warriors with, engaging them, empowering them, gaining their trust on the ground in the community so they don't easily get sucked into this, in my opinion, very normalized now, all of this the sex trade. How do we gain their trust on the ground? What do you want to say about our youth? I believe the internet, we have studies, fuels, has made it easier for all of this. Certainly coming out of COVID, that whole period has fueled it as well. I'm so concerned, David, about our kids,
No, and that's exactly it. And targeting the youth with prevention and education is the key. And I often say it that by the time my office, the district attorney's office is involved, or the police department is involved, unfortunately at that point the trauma has happened. It's not necessarily too late, but we can't undo what was done. So that's why getting that messaging out when kids are younger and understanding and being able to understand making those right, healthy choices will give them the tools to be able to potentially not get recruited by a trafficker. Have that understanding of, hey, this person might be speaking nice to me, but I see that behind the scenes, what they're really trying to get after, that they're not my friend. They're just trying to say the right things to get me to go with them. And all spectrum, and it's not just a bubble of sex trafficking. That's why I think prevention, that is a kind of a wraparound curriculum that targets all the different areas where this is happening. We see trafficking or people getting recruited in gang situations, and it doesn't start off as a trafficking. It's a gang thing where I'm involved in gang activity or hanging out, and then it becomes, oh, now I know this person, they're friends, and now they start again that recruiting and grooming effort. And I think it's coming from all sides. So giving those kids the tools when they're younger to understand what's going on. I know I see sometimes people and parents and want to say like, oh, I'm just not going to let my kid be on social media. I'm going to take away their phones. And that's not going to work, because kids are younger, they're smarter, they understand technology a lot better than us, that we might be technology savvy, but the kids are getting better, and they're going to find a way to get online. Like just telling a kid you're not going on Instagram or Snapchat is not going to be like, okay, I'll stop. They're going to find secret ways where then you won't be able to monitor. You as a parent or a caregiver won't be able to monitor it, won't be able to understand what's going on. And now they're on an area that's completely wide open for danger. Like it used to be that when we were younger, it's don't talk to the stranger on the street, the stranger danger. Now the parents might say, oh, my kid's in their bedroom, I know where they are, they're safe. But they're online, they're playing game, they're on the gaming system, they're talking to people all over the world, they're talking to whomever, and like you have no idea who they're talking to because they're in their bedroom with their door closed. So I think really giving them the kids the understanding and the tools to make those healthy choices. Say, hey, we know you're going to be on social media, we know you're going to do gaming and go places and go to parties, but we want to make sure that you're doing it safe. Know that it doesn't have to be hidden. You don't have to hide from what you're doing, as long as understand like there are dangers out there. These people might not be after your best interest, and oftentimes they're not after your best interest. So if someone's saying, hey, for example, something with sextortion and try to get you to send pictures, if something doesn't feel right and you're uncomfortable, listen to yourself and make that decision. It's okay to say no to someone, not have to feel like, oh, well, he asked me, I don't have a choice, let me send it. And then unfortunately, all the negative things that can happen once that goes down that area, where it's really giving those kids the tools and empower themselves, or they can make those right decisions and say, hey, this is not okay, this isn't good, I'm going to stay away from this. And also, because again, we want to make sure that they can also have a healthy and enjoyable activities, and just locking them in their house every day is not going to do the trick either. So I think that's really that kind of like narrative we have to like weigh, understanding kids are going to do it, and just make sure that they have the support network, have the network that they need that can help them navigate difficult issues growing up.
And I think, I have 50 questions. You opened that up, David. But, I think also, that being said, I almost am focusing more lately on parents and guardians and caretakers. And again, we should point out families today make up all kinds of different units. We have a lot of kids living with grandparents, aunts and uncles. So everybody has to the adults, I'm feeling like we have to really empower them with the tools to know what our kids are dealing with, because we do have a well documented in the United States youth mental health crisis. The kids are savvy, like you pointed out. Look, we live in a digital world that is not going away. We don't want to ban that is a word we do not use. We don't want to control. I feel like we need to formulate these community circles of empowerment, because again, power in numbers, because you can teach a teen everything right, but then they have a friend, who shows them something on a phone or something. So I feel like the adults have to step up a little bit. And this is in no way a judgment. And they have to, because it's scary, the unknown. Because a lot of people will say to me, David, like, oh, I didn't grow up with the internet. Oh, I didn't. But, if we do our jobs efficiently and effectively, we have to know what's going on. So I think the adults, we need to, empower them a little bit as well, of what the kids are going through, and get them to the point where the kids can come to them and not be embarrassed if it's for instance, a case of a sextortion. I mean, when did it become okay for, somebody to send a nude image, even if the teen or child thinks, it's another teen or child? No, 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 no. It's become too normalized. So we just need, I'm going to go back to it, engagement, education, empowerment. None of this is okay. Now,
And that actually is exactly what you had mentioned earlier about the second part of my role, which is we also have a federally funded task force, the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force, which is co-led by the Brooklyn DA's office and Safe Horizon, which is one of the largest service providers in the country, where that is the purpose of being collaborative. And we recognize that law enforcement can't do it alone, service providers can't do it alone. Everybody individually has to work together to do the combat human trafficking and exploitation in a collaborative setting. And part of that mission is we're investigating cases now in a trauma-informed way, where we're working with survivors and advocates and understanding of how to work with victims, how to treat them, how to talk to them, how to understand the life, having community partners, like you mentioned, where we're working with that identification and outreach piece. Where our office, the Brooklyn DA's office, as well as through the Human Trafficking Task Force, does a lot of community outreach and public events and engagements with the community, having that understanding of either awareness events or how to spot the signs, or also understanding technology as it relates to the people in their care, how they can navigate those challenges. I mean, even not trafficking specific, but our office has a lot of engagement in the elder community, giving them the tools to protect themselves against elder abuse. And there's so many, unfortunately, scams out there where there's bad actors that are going to try to take advantage of vulnerable populations. And bringing it back to trafficking, that's ultimately where we're seeing the victims have some type of vulnerability, and traffickers are extremely skilled at attacking that vulnerability, understanding and recognizing that vulnerability and working with that way of, oh, well, you don't have a place to sleep, so you're going to have to stay in my house, or you call the police and they're just going to arrest you, and or you're going to do this. And the traffickers will make up these narratives to kind of put that victim in an area where, like, they're the only person I can rely on, they're the only person I can trust. So working through our task force and our partners, we have regular meetings with different government agencies, all the law enforcement partners from within New York City, state, federal. On the civil side, we're all working together, and with the service provider. So when we have a potential new investigation or a new victim, we have a support network, a team in place where we kind of can reach out, say, hey, we have this victim, we have this survivor that has these immediate needs, who can help, who can assist. And an example, like, so we have it on our website, and it's the wheel, we call it. There's the collaborative wheel for our task force. We're talking about being victim centered. We'll keep the victim is in the middle of this wheel. And around that wheel is law enforcement, which would be police and the prosecutors. There's government services, medical, education, child protective services, all these different organizations and agencies that are very needed and necessary within the system. And within a trafficking victim has a case with the police, they're going to need orders of protection. They're going to be needed to come and testify potentially, or work with the prosecutor. They also have a need for housing. They also have a need for education. Potentially, if there's undocumented status, they're going to need for legal representation or family court, whatever the issues might be. As long as we all recognize we're all the professionals, this is what we get paid to do. This is our job. And obviously, my role is the prosecutor, but I work with service providers. I work with the hospital and ER doctors and nursing staff to like make referrals to us. But I'm not a medical professional. I can't give that medical advice. But as long as we all recognize that the victim is the most important, they're in the center of now the team, everyone, let's get together, and I'm doing my job, medical, you do your job. The trafficker took that person's ID. We're working with the city government to get them their identification back or get new identification. Or housing, we're working with service providers and organizations and partners that provide emergency housing and long-term care and case management. So it really is a whole wraparound system. We're all working together, and that's really that part of that collaborative model where I have a new case. Hey, who do I call? Let me find a phone book, and dating myself by finding a phone book. Now it's going to
Really
Google.
dating yourself.
It's like going to the yellow page. But now it's like, I know that right person. We're going to call
Right.
directly. Or an advocate is working with a client, and that client now feels comfortable working with law enforcement. They can call me directly. They'll call the lieutenant I work with directly. Where part of that comes back to that building that community trust, that we're advocates and we're professionals working to do the right thing and working to assist and keep the community safe, ensure public trust and safety in the community, and recognize that we're good allies, that we are there for the right reasons. And through that outreach and community engagement, we're building that trust in the community. They're saying, hey, we are a resource where you don't have to be afraid. The phone call is, hey, there's a district attorney on the phone, that shouldn't automatically put fear anymore. Now it's like, hey, that might actually, it could be for something good. So that's really what the part of the task force model is, where we do provide a lot of community outreach. We're working together, providing trauma-informed care when we get every survivor. And sometimes trauma-informed care means a case may not be made. And sometimes it is. And obviously, while we're balancing the community safety and trust, but that's all part of what being a trauma-informed practitioner is about. And I think that's kind of that model that we're trying to emulate in our office as a whole for all types of cases, but as it relates to trafficking, working along those avenues.
I mean, your unit, David, really is at the forefront. What you just described and that collaborative wheel, I of course call it the wheel with a lot of spokes, but that's just me. That's how I always describe it, is a fully informed. And you pointed out how all of these different, whether it's medical, law, safe housing, it has to work together. All the pieces have to come together. It cannot work separately. At least that's my opinion. That does not work. I'm going to ask you a question, and don't laugh, David. If somebody's listening to this, describe what your definition of human trafficking is in 2024, because believe it or not, almost on a daily basis, people really don't understand when I talk to them what exactly human trafficking is. They're very confused by it. So they really always think of that typical white van story. They don't understand it's got a lot of different tentacles today.
Absolutely. And again, that white van story doesn't mean it's not true. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen that way, but that's not the common what we see. That's not the typical that we're seeing now. And let me break it down. Let me talk about what actually is trafficking, because it involves, for sex trafficking, an action, means, and purpose. You're doing an action, you're recruiting, you're harboring, you're inducing someone through means, through fraud, force, coercion. Obviously, force is the easiest one. Hey, if you don't engage in what I want you to do on my behalf, I'm going to assault you. I'm going to assault your family. we're going to withhold your documents when we get to labor trafficking, or your immigration status is not necessarily okay. I might call immigration and get you deported as a means of threatening to listen to what I have to say. There's trafficking induced through narcotics, where traffickers will give survivors narcotics to keep them as a means of paying them. Hey, you engage in prostitution, I'll give you drugs, and kind of keep them in that cycle. So that's the means where they're using one type of method for the purpose, whether it's commercial sexual exploitation, labor servitude, one of those means. And in layman's terms, it's like for sex trafficking, it's using force or any other of those means to induce a person to engage in prostitution. Labor trafficking is a little bit more tricky to identify in public because they're working in industries that you and I might frequent on a daily basis, or going to stores in typical stores. But again, it's that same thing, withholding documents, using threats of force or actual violence to induce that person to work in the store for no money and never get breaks and never have any freedom. And they're working in a restaurant for 20 hours a day. They sleep for 2 hours in the back and repeat the next day. So when it breaks it down to, it's really doing that. I didn't say anything about crossing state lines. I didn't say anything about crossing international borders. I think that's another big misconception of the smuggling versus trafficking. Because oftentimes I speak to people and say, "Oh, where did the victim come from? They came from overseas," or so. I'm like, "No, came from Brooklyn or New York somewhere, or somewhere else in the United States." But domestic trafficking is extremely real on the sex and labor side, where everything is happening. The trafficker is can be American born. The victim survivor is American born, and they don't ever even have to have left Brooklyn. They've been born in Brooklyn and stayed in Brooklyn in the confines of the city their entire life and still been trafficked. So I think that's one of the misconceptions of what people think is happening, where it has to have that nexus of international, or it has that kidnapping, and it's just, again, the stranger danger. And another thing is, oftentimes, and more often than not, we see that it's someone known to the person.
Yes.
It could be a family member, or it could be someone that built that trust through a boyfriend, through a friend, through a confidant, where it doesn't start off and grab them and say, "Now you're doing this for me." There really is that grooming process where it's like building their trust, taking them, "Hey, you might be homeless, you don't have a place to stay, you can stay with me, or I'll bring you to this party." And oftentimes we've seen that when involving youth, like, they're going to school. They're also sometimes they're even going home at night. So therefore, like, the parents may not realize what's going on, or not necessarily not realize, but we may not think they're still home. They're not missing. They're not reported missing. That they go to school, or they miss school for a day, or at night they go out. The point, and there's many different scenarios. I'm using kind of a couple different examples. The point is, it's happening right here, and it does not have to have a further nexus from that. So oftentimes it is a person they know, because they're building that trust. Because kids still are savvy, and more often than not, like, if a stranger does come up to them and say, "Hey, I want you to do something that sounds not the most healthy," like, they probably would say no to that. But if it's someone that they know for a little bit and built that trust, and, "Oh, that person can't be that mean to me. They know me. They've been in my house. I've been in their house. They know my family. They must be looking out for my best interest." So really, that's kind of where it comes back to that prevention and recognizing and trusting your gut and making those choices, understanding where people might be coming from, to make sure that we understand it. Because if we don't know what might be happening, also, how can we prevent it? And how can we teach them what not to do if the only narrative is, "Oh, they're being smuggled from overseas in a shipping container," or they're being smuggled across the border, and then you're going to be missing the obvious trafficking that's happening wherever you go on a daily basis. I think that's really the most important thing to recognize, that it's domestic trafficking. And again, not to diminish the international trafficking, because that is a huge part. And we work with our federal partners, and very well when those issues come up. But what we deal with, and what domestic trafficking is, does not need that nexus.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, because there's different studies, but roughly around 50% usually say, David, familial trafficking. It's somebody the person knows, the child knows, the teen knows. And I think that is a big misconception, that people don't realize it's that close to, that child, that teen, that person. It's right, as we usually hear, in our own backyard. So that's very important for people to recognize the child can be going to school every day and sleeping in their own bed at night. And we've got those scenarios with, the Romeo, with the girls thinking it's a boyfriend, and it starts out that way. Very common. So we have to really, I know it's dark and ugly, because people tell me, "Lynn, I can't handle it, because it's, We have to handle it because this is the reality of what's happening. David, fill us in. What are some of the laws that are on the books in Brooklyn, in New York, to deal with the trafficking?
So the biggest law is sex trafficking, and I said earlier in the program, like, that the distinction between an adult and versus someone less than 18. If we're talking about an adult victim, adult survivor, and I use the term victim because in the legal context that's just how they're referred to, but obviously
Mhm.
there's everyone's a survivor. There has to be that element of fraud, force, or coercion to compel the person to engage in, on the sex side, and sex trafficking, to whether it's means of fraud, withholding documents, public shaming based on their gender status or identity. There's many different factors of where it rises from coercion to force, but any element of fraud, force, or coercion has to be present when it involves an adult victim. When it's talking with a child, and the law defines a child being anyone under 18, so 17 and below, and the traffickers above 21, there has to be, or 21 and above, there has to be, actually, there does not have to be the force. That's the difference. Like, there does not have to have force anymore. The law used to be that way. In 2018, it was changed where we do no longer need to prove that the 14-year-old engaged in prostitution for the trafficker through means of force. And now it's in line with the federal definition. Younger
Mhm.
than 18, they're per se trafficking victim. And then
Yeah.
within that, then there's lesser included offenses of promoting prostitution and the related that we would potentially would charge on a given case. And on the labor side, there isn't labor trafficking statute, which is pretty much mirrors the language of sex trafficking, but again, the purpose is for labor servitude as opposed to commercial sexual exploitation.
If somebody's listening, David, and a common scenario is people don't even realize they may be trafficked. They don't even know. They don't. If somebody's listening, what would you advise them to do? So they're in Brooklyn, and we have a lot of warriors in Brooklyn. Uh, what would be some of the indicators to wake them up, and what should they do?
So in terms of some of the indicators, and again, like, I'm going to start with the disclaimer and the caveat that just because an indicator is present, and even if there's several indicators that's present, it does not mean that person is being trafficked. Like one indicator used to always be multiple cell phones. I think where, oh, that youth that shouldn't have done, doesn't understand where they may have that money coming from, is walking around with fancy clothes and multiple cell phones. Yes, that could be an indicator, but that in and of itself is not calling a police hotline and saying, hey, that person's being trafficked. I would add, though, that from that indicators of cell phones, now with the influx of voice internet calls where they don't need multiple cell phones anymore, they can have one cell phone with four different numbers on it. That would just change a little bit of that indicator, but that still is something that would be cause for concern. Why does a kid have multiple different phone numbers that they're regularly changing, which could be an indicator of swapping out numbers that are in advertisements or things like that, or having communications with people that can't track it. So I will say that, I mean, with youth, I mean, money is an issue. It's not an issue, but it could be a concern of, like, where, let's look further. Where is this coming from? Missing a lot of school, not really having good explanations of where they're staying, talking about giving hints potentially about having survival sex, or having to, like, kind of find places to crash where they don't have a safe spot. Little things like that of, like, not knowing where they're coming from, always coming from a different place, having potentially someone with them. They go into it's an emergency setting in a medical. They're going to the emergency room and they're having someone with them that won't leave their side during the exam, or the doctor or nurse will ask them questions and then that person will answer for them, or kind of what seems like those, like, scripted answers, things like that. Those are potentially, like, red flags that we would see if certain incidents where they're talking about certain things of, like, oh, my boyfriend got mad at me because I didn't have enough money or I didn't make anything. That potentially could be an indicator of, like, why do you have to give him anything? Things like that. Indicators in labor trafficking could be also they're not in control of their documents. If they're trying to apply for something and, oh, my friend has my ID or my boss has my ID, that could be a red flag of, like, why does your employer hold on to your documents? Oh, they say it so I don't lose it. So I'm forgetful. That could be potentially an indicator where they're not in control of their movement. And again, being in control of movement doesn't have to be locked in a cart. That's why sometimes I cringe when I see these, like, anti-trafficking posters or flyers where it's the girl chained to a radiator or locked in a closet. Like, they can't freely move. Like, the coercion, the threat of force element can be present even when you're walking down the street, it's like, oh, they can't be kidnapped because they walked down to the store to buy things for themselves. No one was with them. But again, the trafficker, some of the means is, hey, you can leave, but I know where you live. I know where your little
Yeah.
sister goes to school, or things like that. So it kind of fearful to force them to kind of come back. So those are type of trafficking signs that I think to look out for. But and again, like, and there's several others, and people talk all the time about different ones. But again, like, what they can do, I think, is a different story of recognizing it. And I think that depends on who they are. If it's in a professional setting where it's a teacher or medical where there's mandated reporters, then they have their own protocols of how they report in hotlines. If it's a concerned citizen, there's various hotlines where they can call in. Or we have in the Brooklyn DA's office a dedicated human trafficking hotline there where they can call. The police department has hotlines. The National Human Trafficking Hotline has signs up all over the place of the Polaris tip line where they can make those calls. So I think you can make those calls, and you should. If you have a real suspicion of trafficking, you can make those calls. They can be anonymous or not. And there's no harm sometimes in making those calls. We'll
Yes.
investigate, we'll look into it, and if it turns out it's unfounded, better that we checked and nothing happened than always leave it to the next person. Oh, I don't need to call because the person after me will call. So I think it's, but also the one thing to keep in mind is also be safe. Don't insert yourself into a situation where potentially that could put yourself in danger, and also the trafficking victim, where if you're at the bus stop or Port Authority and you see something that might look like you're trafficking, and you, oh, the girl looked, she wasn't happy, she forlorn, the pimp was dragging her around. If you as a bystander try to interfere, that could potentially cause more harm to that person later on. So just be mindful of those situations of what you can do before you get yourself into those. It's like step in and kind of like try to be that hero to save the day. So just kind of keep all that in mind of those deeper, what's going to happen 5 minutes later if you just start yelling and screaming without notifying the proper authorities.
Right. And we'll have all those hotlines 718-250-2770.
Yes.
I believe is your hotline directly. I think, David, people have to have these numbers programmed in their phones. Something I'd like to see, I digress here a little bit, is, we have the 988 now for suicide crisis prevention lifeline, obviously 911. I'd like to see a 3-digit code for all of this human trafficking that people could easily program in their phones, kids could know about. Any buzz on that? You hear anything about that?
They're working on all of that. As far as
Okay.
just resources and resource guides, what we started doing now, what we did with the Brooklyn DA's office, implementing with the New York City Mayor's office to end domestic and gender-based violence, we have a comprehensive resource guide, a citywide resource guide for human trafficking survivors, which I can provide to you, that you can provide to your listeners and viewers, where we made it now with a QR code where it's scannable, where we hand it out when we encounter potential trafficking victims and survivors on the streets. It's an anonymous looking card where it's a QR code where if they scan it, it opens up a very comprehensive resource guide that with filled with case management, government resources, and government hotline tips, but not just from the legal and government side. It's all the different housing and shelter options in the city, all the different agencies. Like I mentioned, as part of our task force, we work collaboratively with all those agencies, and they're all in this guide of what they offer, what their organization offers, what type of survivors they service, the languages, the cultural and ethically appropriate services, if that's what someone's looking for, where they can kind of search for that and have a real good kind of comprehensive resource guide that's on their phone. Where like, hey, I'm looking for this service, this type of program, case management, medical, whatever it might be. Where now that with that QR code, it opens up to a live PDF on their phones, and they can kind of scroll through that way and really see the lay of the land of the services that's out there that we can offer for survivors.
Oh, I need that. Is it on the website? Well, you'll send it to me, but is
I'll
it
send
on
it to you
it?
right after this call. Yes.
Oh, I love that because I'll be sharing that constantly with everybody, adding it to everything we post so people know, because that's it. They have to have easy,
Right.
split second decisions at their fingertips. They can't think too much about anything. They just have to know they have a resource. And as we know, people like easy. So this has to be, I love, that is great. I love that. I'll be sharing that. David, finish us up with how can the community help you? Some final words.
I think keep doing that, what you're doing, being diligent, looking out for, and I think that's what it comes down to, looking out for each other. I know oftentimes as New Yorkers like to kind of just put their head down, march straight along without looking at the outside bubble. And I think we need to be vigilant. We need to understand what's around us. If we see someone
Yes.
that might be suffering, kind of be that potential voice and help. And just working together. It's identification, making referrals, working when we need the community. We're out in the community, showing who everybody is. So there's no surprises and nobody's strangers to each other, because I think we're one. It's a huge city, but it's small, and I think we all need to work together and help each other, because today it's someone else's child, tomorrow it might be someone closer to them. So I think understanding those tools, understanding how to treat people better and work with kids and survivors, I think can help. Kind of might be that person say, hey, this person was nice to me, they smiled at me, gave me the impetus to kind of trust someone. That police officer looked at me and was nice, and now I feel comfortable. Hey, I need help. Can you, things like that. So I think it real little steps, baby steps, goes a long way in the long term. And from speaking to survivors and hearing from other presenters, people speaking, talking about, everyone has like that anecdote of like one little thing where that got one survivor help, and that kind of like became a huge thing. So you never know, with the little difference, one being kind can help. So I think really that could be a message of just be kind to each other.
Now, David, I actually lied, because now with you just saying that, it reminded me that I do think we live in an environment, in my opinion, where we now have to really look out for each other. I don't care. It's New York City, because we take care of each other. Like you said, it's big, but it's small. And I think this video is going to help tremendously, sharing information, sharing resources. It's okay to talk about all of this. It's okay to talk to your child, your neighbor. It's okay. All of this, we have to kind of bring this out into the open. It is conversation today we have to have. I just want to point out also with the survivors, it is so important that the public learn to step up, support them, listen to their voices. I've never been trafficked. I can talk about it, till I'm blue in the face, but it's their learned and lived experiences that help us do our jobs better. And also, we need to support survivor leaders, so their voice can resonate for those impacted by this. And so I want everybody to get on board with that. David Weiss, you know what? Community creates change. BrooklynDA.org is the website. You are truly a warrior. I want to thank you for taking the time today, also for the work you do. It is so, I think it's the most important work we have facing us, as a community, as a society today, not only in Brooklyn or New York State, just around our country, around the world. And you are doing a terrific job. I mean this from the bottom of my heart, being the chief of the Human Trafficking Unit at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office and the task force, and everything you do. We are here to help you and support you in any way. Thank you, David Weiss. Thank you so much. Today, you are our warrior of the day.
Thank you very much, Lynn.
Thanks, David.
Yeah.